There is a circle in the grass that was not there yesterday. You might have passed this field 100 times and never noticed anything unusual about it. But this morning, in the early light, there it is, a ring of darker grass or a ring of mushrooms, perfectly formed, perhaps 2 meters across, perhaps 10, sitting in the middle of an otherwise ordinary meadow, with no obvious explanation and no obvious source. The ring is complete, the circle is closed, and something about the way it sits in the landscape, the precision of it, the completeness, the sense that it has been made rather than simply grown, makes you hesitate at the field's edge rather than simply walking in. Across the folklore of Britain, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and much of Northern Europe, this hesitation is the correct response. The circular mark in the grass or the earth, the fairy ring, the fairy circle, the elf ring, the pixie ring, the hag's track, the witch's dance, was one of the most widely recognized signs in the old landscape, a sign that something had been here, or was still here, or would return here, and that the person who walked into the centre of it, without understanding what it was, had made a decision that they would not be able to simply walk away from. The prohibition on entering fairy rings is among the most specific and most consistently maintained warnings in British and Irish folk tradition. Unlike many folklore prohibitions, which can be somewhat vague about their consequences, the fairy ring prohibition is precise. Enter the ring and you will find yourself in fairy time, unable to stop dancing, unable to leave, unable to perceive how long you have been there, returned at last, if you're returned, to a human world that has moved years or decades beyond the moment you stepped in. The tradition knew exactly what happened. It had apparently watched it happen enough times to describe it very clearly. Tonight, we will explore 10 quiet chapters on why you should never enter a fairy ring. We will begin with the ring itself, what it is, what the old tradition believed caused it, and why its circular form was understood as meaningful rather than accidental. We will look at the science beneath the story, the fungal biology that generates fairy rings in the real world, and what it tells us about why the rings appeared where they did and behaved as they did. We will follow the music that the tradition always associated with the ring, the irresistible sound that drew mortals in and kept them there. We will examine the time distortion that was the ring's most terrifying consequence, the way an hour inside became a year outside, and what the tradition made of that. We will look at the accounts of those who entered and returned, the testimonies collected by folklorists across the centuries, the specific, detailed accounts of what happened. We will explore the rescues, the methods by which a person could be pulled from a fairy ring, and why those methods worked. We will trace the ring into the literary tradition, where it generated some of the most enduring imagery in English poetry and prose. We will consider what the fairy ring reveals about the Celtic understanding of sacred space, of circles, boundaries, and the meaning of the enclosed. We will look at the ring as it appears in contemporary life, in folk practice, in the persistence of the warning, in the surprising modern resonance of a very old belief. And finally, we will sit with the question of what the fairy ring means as a symbol, what the old storytellers were really saying when they drew their circle in the grass and warned you not to step inside. Before we begin, if these slow journeys through the older stories bring you rest, I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. And if the world of fairy lore and the mystical cottagecore life speaks to you, our curated collection of nature-inspired shirts is linked in the description below. Now settle in. The night is quiet. Somewhere in a field not too far from here, the circle is complete. We are going to look at it carefully from the outside where it is safe and understand what it means. Before the science, there was the observation. For thousands of years before anyone understood the biology of fungi, people noticed that rings appeared in meadows and fields with a regularity that seemed to exceed coincidence and with a precision of form that seemed to exceed anything that ordinary natural processes could explain. The rings were circular, not approximately circular, not oval or irregular, but genuinely, carefully circular, as though something had drawn them with a compass. They appeared overnight, or seemed to. The field that showed no ring at dusk might show a clear one at dawn. They persisted for years in the same location, sometimes growing slightly larger each year, but maintaining their essential character. And they had properties that ordinary grass did not. The grass within the ring was sometimes lusher and greener than the grass outside it, sometimes darker and more rank, sometimes bare and withered, as though something had exhausted it. The tradition's explanation for all of this was simple and consistent. The rings were where the fairies had danced. The circle was the trace left by a night of fairy dancing, the grass pressed down by fairy feet, or the mushrooms grown where fairy feet had touched the earth, or the darkened soil left where fairy energy had been concentrated in the tight, perfect circle of the fairy reel. The ring was not a symptom of an underlying process, but the direct, legible mark of fairy activity, as readable to those who knew the tradition as a footprint in mud. The mushroom ring was the most commonly described form, and also the most visually striking. The Marasmius oreades, the fairy bonnet, sometimes called the fairy ring champignon, is among the species most commonly found growing in the characteristic ring formation, though many other fungi produce similar patterns. These rings of mushrooms, appearing overnight after rain in late summer and autumn, had a quality that made them feel like arrivals from another world. They were not there, and then they were, appearing in the night without visible cause, forming circles of such regularity that the natural explanation that they were the fruiting bodies of an underground fungal network was invisible to pre-scientific observers. The folklore assigned different properties to different kinds of fairy rings, and the distinctions were maintained with some care. A ring of lush dark grass was a ring where the fairies had recently danced, the earth enriched by their passage, the grass fed by whatever vitality the fairies left behind them. A ring of bare earth, or of withered and yellowed grass, was a ring where the fairies had danced for longer and more intensely, exhausting the soil with the power of their activity. A ring of mushrooms was the most explicitly fairy associated of all, the mushrooms themselves understood as the fairies' own crop, their harvest, their particular and characteristic product. The size of fairy rings varied considerably in the tradition, and the size was understood as meaningful. Small rings, a metre or two across, were the rings of lesser fairy folk, the brownies and the small spirits who danced in modest company. Larger rings, 5 metres, 10 metres, were the rings of greater beings, of the lords and ladies of the cedar, or the powerful spirits of specific places. The largest rings of all, the great circles that sometimes extended across significant portions of the field, were understood with particular awe. They were the dancing places of fairy royalty, of beings of such power and such company, that their dance left a mark that persisted for generations. The time of day associated with fairy rings was consistently the liminal hours, dusk and dawn, the transitions between light and dark, and above all, midnight, the middle of the night, the moment farthest from both dawn and dusk. The fairies danced in the tradition when the boundary between their world and the human world was thinnest, and the thinness of the boundary was associated with the thinness of the light, the times when the full bright clarity of midday and the full dark depth of deep night gave way to something in between. At midnight, at the moment when the day technically changed from one date to another, the boundary was at its thinnest of all, and the dancing was at its most intense. The music that accompanied the dancing, always described as extraordinarily beautiful, as unlike anything the human world could produce, as compelling to anyone who heard it in a way that no ordinary music was understood as audible from the ring itself or from the air just above it, even when no visible dancers were present. The ring retained the echo of its making. The place where the dancing had happened continued to carry some quality of the dancing even in its absence, the way a warm hearth retains heat after the fire has died. To stand at the edge of a fairy ring and listen, in the quiet of a still night, was sometimes to hear the ghost of the music, a sound at the edge of hearing, uncertain, probably the wind, probably nothing, but possibly exactly what you thought it was. The ecology of the fairy ring, which we will examine in detail in the next chapter, produced the visual features that the tradition observed and interpreted. The lush grass, the withered grass, the mushrooms, the persistent circle year after year, growing slightly but maintaining its form. The tradition's interpretation was supernatural. The cause was biological. But the observation that generated both the interpretation and the biology was the same. Something here is different. Something makes this place distinct from the ground around it. Something has organized this space into a circle, and that organization has consequences for anything that enters it. The tradition distinguished carefully between different kinds of rings and their implications for the person who encountered them. A ring that was freshly formed, new mushrooms standing bright and firm, the grass mark still sharp at its edges, was understood as a ring where the fairy activity had occurred very recently, perhaps within the last night or two. The fairies might still be near. The energy of the dancing was still fresh in the soil. A ring that was well established, mushrooms in various stages of growth and decay, the grass mark softened and slightly irregular at its outer edge, was a ring that had been in use for seasons or years, one that the fairies returned to regularly. Both kinds were dangerous, but in different ways. The fresh ring because the fairies were close, the established ring because its claim on the space was deep and well-rooted. The orientation of a fairy ring in relation to the surrounding landscape was also considered meaningful in several traditions. A ring that opened, in the sense of being near a gap in a hedge or a gate or a path toward a known fairy haunt, was a ring on an active fairy route, a point along the path that the fairies used regularly in their passage through the landscape. A ring that was isolated in the middle of a field, with no obvious connection to any known fairy territory, was sometimes understood as a ring that the fairies had established specifically in that location for reasons that were opaque to the human observer, and the opacity itself was understood as a caution. What you cannot understand about a fairy ring is often more significant than what you can. The oral tradition that preserved the fairy ring prohibition also preserved specific accounts of what it felt like to approach one, not to enter it, but simply to come close to its edge. Several accounts describe a quality of the air near a fairy ring that distinguished it from the air around it, a stillness that was not the stillness of a windless day, a sound at the threshold of hearing, a slight sensation of pressure or of watching. The person who noticed these sensory changes was advised to stop and to choose their path carefully, to go around the ring rather than through it, to give it the same wide berth they would give any space they did not fully understand. The ring was real, its form was real, its persistence was real, and the tradition that grew up around it was an attempt, serious, careful, transmitted with genuine concern for the people who would encounter it, to account for something genuinely strange in the landscape. Whether you accept the fairy explanation or the fungal one, The strangeness the tradition was responding to was genuine. The ring in the grass was not nothing, it was something, and the question of what to do about it, whether to step in or to stay out, was a question with real consequences. The specific mushroom species most commonly associated with fairy rings in the British Isles each had its own place in the folk understanding of the ring's character. Marasmius oreades, the fairy ring champignon, whose almond scent distinguished it from other small brown mushrooms of the grassland, was the species most specifically named in connection with fairy dancing in the English and Scottish traditions. Clitocybe nibularis, the cloud funnel, a larger and more imposing species that sometimes formed rings in woodlands, was associated with a different and more powerful category of fairy, the woodland spirits rather than the meadow spirits, and the puffball, which sometimes appeared inside or near fairy rings, was connected in several traditions to the fairy's own use of smoke or breath. The puffball's cloud of spores understood as the visible exhalation of the fairy presence that the ring marked. The folk practice of marking a known fairy ring with a specific stone or post, not to claim the space but to warn others about it, was documented in several areas of rural Ireland and Scotland well into the 20th century. The marker was not a fence or a barrier, it was a sign, the landscape equivalent of a warning written in a shared language. The marker said, "We have noticed this, we have attended to it, and you should attend to it too." The practice of marking reflected the tradition's understanding of itself as a community responsibility. The knowledge of where the dangerous places were was not private information, but common knowledge, maintained and shared for the benefit of everyone who used the landscape. The tradition also noted that some fairy rings appeared in the same location for so many consecutive generations that they became named features of the local landscape, given the same kind of specific, remembered place name that was given to a notable tree or a particular hill. These named rings were not simply warnings, but landmarks, reference points in the community's mental map of the territory. To say "meet me at the old fairy ring in the south field" was to give a precise location, as reliable as any other named feature of the landscape. The ring had become, through long persistence and long attention, as much a part of the place as the geological features around it. The ring was real. Its form was real. Its persistence was real. And the tradition that grew up around it was an attempt, serious, careful, transmitted with genuine concern for the people who would encounter it, to account for something genuinely strange in the landscape. Whether you accept the fairy explanation or the fungal one, the strangeness the tradition was responding to was genuine. The ring in the grass was not nothing, it was something, and the question of what to do about it, whether to step in or to stay out, was a question with real consequences. The fairy ring is one of the places where the folk tradition and the natural sciences meet most instructively, where what the tradition observed and what the science later explained are not in conflict but in conversation, each illuminating the other. The biology of the fairy ring begins underground, in the invisible world of fungal mycelium. When a fungal spore lands in suitable soil and begins to germinate, it sends out fine threads, hyphae, that grow outward in all directions from the point of germination. Over time, these hyphae branch and interconnect to form a mat called mycelium, a network of threads that is the true body of the fungus, the part that actually lives in and on and through the soil. The fruiting bodies we call mushrooms, the caps and stems that appear above ground, are simply the reproductive structures, the fungus's way of dispersing its spores into the world. As the mycelium grows outward from the original germination point, it depletes the nutrients in the soil at its centre. The oldest part of the mycelium, the part nearest the original spore, uses up the available nitrogen and other nutrients in the soil it inhabits, and when those nutrients are exhausted, the mycelium in the centre dies back, but the outer edge of the mycelium continues to grow, reaching into soil that has not yet been depleted. The result is a ring of living mycelium expanding outward through the soil with a dead or exhausted zone at its centre, and the ring of fruiting bodies, when the conditions for mushroom production are met, appears exactly where the living edge of the mycelium is, forming the characteristic circular shape. The ring grows outward at a rate that depends on the species of fungus and the condition of the soil, but the rate is consistent. The same ring in the same location will grow by a predictable amount each year. Some of the largest fairy rings known to science are understood to be hundreds of years old, the mycelium having been expanding outward from its original germination point across many human generations. The fairy ring champignon, Marasmius oreades, is among the most persistent, capable of producing rings that grow for centuries in suitable grassland. The effect of the fungal mycelium on the grass above it explains several of the features that the tradition associated with fairy rings. The lush, dark grass within, or just inside the ring, results from the nitrogen released into the soil as the mycelium decomposes organic matter, a natural fertilization that makes the grass grow more vigorously and more darkly green than the surrounding unfertilized sward. The bare or withered zone sometimes seen at the ring's inner edge results from the mycelium's consumption of water and nutrients at a rate that can exceed the grass's ability to survive. The mycelium literally drinks the soil dry, creating a drought-like condition in the soil it dominates. The outer edge of the ring, where the mycelium is actively growing into new soil, sometimes shows another band of lush growth, creating the classic triple band effect. Lush inner grass, bare middle zone, lush outer band, ordinary grass beyond. The overnight appearance of mushroom rings, the quality that made them seem so magical to pre-scientific observers, is explained by the biology of mushroom fruiting. The mycelium lives underground year-round, invisible and essentially undetectable. When conditions become suitable for fruiting, typically warm, humid conditions in late summer and autumn, often following significant rainfall, the mycelium produces mushrooms very rapidly, pushing them through the soil surface in a matter of hours. A ring that was invisible at dusk can be fully formed by dawn, the mushrooms having completed their emergence during the night. The speed is biological, not magical, but the effect on the observer is the same. The ring appears from nowhere. The distribution of fairy rings in the landscape reflects the biology rather than any fairy preference for particular locations. Rings tend to appear most frequently in old undisturbed grassland, meadows and field boundaries and common land that has not been ploughed or heavily fertilized, where the soil is relatively nutrient poor, and the fungal competition is such that a single mycelium can dominate a large area over many years. Ancient parkland, traditional hay meadows, upland grassland, these are the habitats where fairy rings are most common, and not coincidentally, these are the habitats where the tradition most consistently located fairy activity. The relationship between the fungal biology and the tradition's observations is not one of pure coincidence. The fungal mycelium produces real effects on the plants above it, effects that are observable to anyone paying careful attention to the landscape, effects that mark the ring's location as reliably as any visible sign. The tradition read these effects as signs of fairy activity, because fairy activity was its explanatory framework for unusual natural phenomena. The science reads them as effects of fungal biology because fungal biology is its explanatory framework for the same phenomena. The phenomena themselves are identical, only the framework for understanding them differs. What the science does not fully explain is the cultural weight that fairy rings carried, the specific and detailed tradition of what happened to a person who entered one, the consistent account across so many separate traditions of the time distortion and the irresistible music, and the impossibility of leaving. The biology of Marasmius aureades does not produce these effects. Something else was generating the tradition, something that the biology alone cannot account for, and that requires the other chapters of this story to begin to understand. The chemistry of the fairy ring's effect on the soil above it is more complex than the simple nutrient depletion story suggests. The mycelium of Marasmius aureades and related species produces a range of compounds that affect plant growth in ways that are still not fully understood. Some of these compounds appear to stimulate grass growth. Nitrogen-containing molecules released by the mycelium's decomposition of organic matter make the grass above the mycelium's active edge grow more vigorously. Other compounds appear to suppress grass growth. Volatile chemicals produced by the mycelium itself seem to inhibit the germination of grass seeds and the growth of established grass plants in the zone where the mycelium is most dense. The result is the multi-banded appearance, lush, bare, lush again, that the folk tradition observed and interpreted as the mark of the fairy dance. The phenomenon of fairy rings producing a zone of dead or dying grass that is then replaced by a zone of enhanced growth is visible across scales ranging from small domestic lawns to large open grasslands. In garden settings, homeowners sometimes encounter fairy rings as a frustrating lawn problem, the alternating bands of lush and bare grass disrupting the uniform green that conventional lawn management aims for. In the ecological context of old grassland, the same rings are understood very differently as signs of a stable, complex, long-established fungal community, indicators of ecological quality, evidence of a history of minimal disturbance. The same phenomenon that is a problem in the garden is a virtue in the meadow, depending entirely on what you value. The smell associated with fairy rings, the distinctive odour of certain fairy ring fungi, particularly Marasmius aureades, which has an almond-like or marzipan scent that is quite unlike the smell of most other mushrooms, may have contributed to the tradition's account of fairy feasting and fairy presents. The smell is pleasant, unusual, and unexpected in the context of an ordinary meadow. The kind of smell that makes you stop and look around for its source, that suggests something specific and intentional, rather than the random sense of ordinary grass and soil. In the pre-scientific tradition, an unusual and specifically pleasant smell, arising from a circular patch of ground in an ordinary field, would reasonably have been associated with fairy activity, with cooking perhaps, or with the residue of fairy celebration, or simply with the particular quality of the fairy world's presence as it pressed against this spot in the human landscape. The ring in the grass is real, its biology is understood, but the tradition was responding to more than the biology. It was responding to something in human experience of these places, something in the quality of attention that old grassland commands, something in the way that certain kinds of landscape presence accumulate over time, something in the specifically human encounter with circles drawn in the earth by processes that feel, whatever their cause, like intention. The science explains the ring. The tradition explains what it felt like to stand at its edge. The discovery of the fairy ring's biological cause, the fungal mycelium, and its characteristic growth pattern was not a sudden revelation that immediately displaced the folk explanation. The biological account developed gradually through the 18th and 19th centuries, and for a considerable period, the two explanations coexisted in the same culture, accepted by different people and used in different contexts. The naturalist, who could explain the fairy ring in terms of fungal growth and nutrient chemistry, might still, when walking through a meadow at dusk and encountering a ring of mushrooms, experience the same quality of attention arrest that the folk tradition had always described. The explanation did not dissolve the phenomenon. The phenomenon persisted, demanding attention, whether or not the explanation was biological or supernatural. The relationship between the fairy ring's biological reality and its cultural significance is, finally, a relationship of mutual reinforcement rather than mutual exclusion. The biology made the rings real, persistent, reliably occurring in the same locations year after year. The cultural tradition made the rings significant, gave them a place in the community's understanding of the landscape, transmitted across generations the observation that these places deserved attention, and the advice about what kind of attention was appropriate. Without the biology, there would have been no rings to observe. Without the cultural tradition, the rings would have been noticed and then forgotten, unremarked features of a landscape that had many unremarked features. It was the combination, real phenomenon, cultural significance, that made the fairy ring what it was. The fairy ring's capacity to produce its effects on the soil, and therefore on the grass, without any above-ground evidence for months or years at a time, is one of the most ecologically interesting aspects of its biology. The mycelium exists and operates entirely underground for most of the year, its presence invisible and undetectable by any ordinary means of observation. The ring appears in the landscape's visible surface only when fruiting conditions are met, when the rain has come in the right amount and the temperature has been right for long enough. In between these fruiting episodes, there is no visible sign that the ring exists, and yet the mycelium is there, growing, consuming, enriching and depleting in its characteristic pattern, doing all the work that will make the ring visible again when the conditions return. The ring in the grass is real. Its biology is understood. But the tradition was responding to more than the biology. It was responding to something in human experience of these places, something in the quality of attention that old grassland commands, something in the way that certain kinds of landscape presence accumulate over time, something in the specifically human encounter with circles drawn in the earth by processes that feel, whatever their cause, like intention. The science explains the ring. The tradition explains what it felt like to stand at its edge. Of all the elements of the fairy ring tradition, the music is perhaps the most immediately comprehensible and the most immediately strange. Comprehensible because the experience of music as irresistible, as something that compels physical response, that makes the body want to move before the mind has decided to, that bypasses the rational will and speaks directly to something more physical and more immediate, is one of the most universal of human experiences. Every culture that has ever produced music has noticed that music does something to the body that goes beyond pleasant sensation, that it can compel movement, compel emotion, compel states of mind that the listener had not intended and might not have chosen. The folk tradition's account of fairy music as irresistible is, at one level, simply an extreme statement of something everyone who has responded to music has experienced in a milder form. Strange, because the tradition's account of fairy music goes well beyond the ordinary irresistibility of music into a specific and consistent description of compulsion so complete that it overrode everything else: hunger, thirst, pain, the passage of time, the memory of home and family, and the life that existed outside the ring. The mortal who heard fairy music and stepped into the ring to dance was not simply swept up in an enjoyable experience. They were caught. The dancing continued, not because the dancer wanted to continue, but because the dancer had lost the capacity to stop. The music was not merely compelling, it was consuming. The tradition described fairy music with a consistent set of qualities that distinguished it from any human music. It was faster than human music, danced at a speed that no human musician could sustain, that exhausted human listeners just to hear it, that drove the compelled dancer to movement beyond any human physical capacity. It was more beautiful than human music, not beautiful in a way that the listener could describe or account for, but beautiful in a way that made all other music, heard afterwards, seem thin and insufficient by comparison, and it was specifically designed, in the tradition's understanding, to prevent the listener from leaving. The music that began did not end, did not pause, did not offer any natural stopping place at which the dancer might rest and catch their breath and find the moment of clarity in which to step out of the ring. The instruments described in association with fairy music were the instruments of the Celtic tradition, the fiddle above all, but also the pipes, the harp, the bodhran, and, in some accounts, instruments that had no human equivalent, instruments that the witness could not name because they had never been seen in the human world. The fiddle was the most consistently reported fairy instrument, and its association with the fairy music tradition is so strong that it persists into the present. The best fiddle players in Irish and Scottish tradition were sometimes said to have learned their art from the fairies, to have acquired their uncanny skill through a night spent in a fairy ring or at a fairy gathering. The fairy fiddler, the supernatural musician who could play with inhuman skill and inhuman endurance, appears in numerous accounts as the agent of the compulsion. It was not the ring itself that trapped the dancer. It was the musician at the ring's centre or at its edge, whose playing no human could resist and whose music did not stop. The fairy fiddler was not always visible. Sometimes only the music was heard, its source unknown, its location impossible to determine, but when visible was described with a consistent quality of uncanny competence, fingers moving faster than any human hand should move, the fiddle producing sounds of impossible richness and complexity, the musician's face showing neither effort nor emotion, simply playing. Several accounts in the tradition describe specific tunes associated with fairy ring compulsion, tunes that, once heard in the context of the ring, would cause involuntary dancing whenever they were heard subsequently, even outside the ring, even years after the original encounter. The tune had been inscribed on the hearer's body by the experience, and the inscription persisted, retrievable by the sound of the right notes in the right sequence. This is a specific and interesting variant of the name power tradition. The tune is a kind of name for the relationship between the hearer and the fairy world, a connection that persists after the encounter and that can be activated by the right sound. The healing function of music in Celtic tradition provides an interesting counterpoint to the music's compulsive function in the fairy ring. The same tradition that described fairy music as an instrument of captivity also described music as an instrument of healing, of consolation, of the restoration of the mental balance that had been disturbed by grief or trauma or supernatural interference. The best healers in Celtic tradition were the musicians, the poets, the people who understood how sound worked on the human mind and body. The fairy ring's music was the dark version of the same power, the compulsive, consuming, time-dissolving version of the same capacity for music to take over the body and the mind and the sense of time that the healer's music deployed in its gentler form. The music that the tradition associated with fairy rings was, at some level, a description of what it felt like to be fully absorbed by music, to enter the state in which music is all there is, in which the self dissolves into the rhythm and the melody, in which time passes without being noticed, and the world outside the music becomes irrelevant. This state is not rare. Any musician or passionate listener knows it. The tradition looked at this state, this complete absorption, this loss of the ordinary self in the musical experience, and said, "This is what happens when you enter the ring. The music takes you, the time passes invisibly, you dance and cannot stop, and when the music finally ends, you find that the world outside has moved on without you." The tradition's account of fairy music's speed, its tempo beyond human capacity, has an interesting physiological dimension. Extremely fast music, played at a tempo the body cannot match, with deliberate conscious movement, produces a different kind of dancing from ordinary dancing, a kind of surrender to the rhythm, rather than a controlled response to it, in which the body moves faster than intention can direct it, in which the self that is choosing what to do is outrun by the rhythm's demands. This state of rhythm surrender is well documented in ethnomusicological studies of ecstatic dance traditions across many cultures. The Sufi whirling dervish, the trance dancing of certain West African and Afro-diasporic traditions, the ecstatic movement practices of various shamanic traditions. In all of these, the speed and insistency of the music is understood as the mechanism by which ordinary consciousness is bypassed and a different state, a state of direct contact with the sacred or the supernatural, is achieved. The fairy ring's music was understood as producing exactly this state, a rhythm surrender so complete that the dancer's ordinary consciousness was effectively absent for the duration. This is not metaphorically what the tradition described, it is quite literally what it described. The dancer who entered the ring and began to dance was not present in the ordinary sense. Their body was moving, performing complex, physically demanding movements, but the consciousness that normally directed those movements was somewhere else, in a state that resembled nothing so much as the ecstatic trance states of shamanic or religious traditions, except that it had been entered involuntarily rather than through deliberate practice and preparation. The recovery from this state, the moment of return when the dancer stepped or was pulled out of the ring, was described in the accounts with a consistency that suggests it was a recognizable and specific experience. The person who came out of the ring experienced something like waking from a very deep sleep, a gradual return of awareness, a sense of having been away somewhere, a difficulty in locating themselves in time and space. The world looked normal, but felt strange, as though the colours were slightly wrong, or the distances not quite what they should have been. The people around them, if they had been gone long enough for people to have gathered, looked older in ways that were initially incomprehensible. The irresistibility of the music was not a flaw in the human listener's character. The tradition did not blame the mortal who entered the ring for weakness of will or failure of discipline. The music was simply beyond human resistance. It was music made by beings whose relationship to sound and rhythm and the human body was deeper and more direct than any human musician could match. To enter the ring and hear the music was to encounter something that your capacity for resistance was not designed to handle. The tradition did not say, "Be stronger." It said, "Do not enter the ring," because once you could hear the music, being stronger was no longer the point. The tradition's understanding of why the fairy music was specifically and particularly irresistible to humans connects to a broader Celtic understanding of the relationship between music and the soul. In the Irish tradition, the soul was understood as having a particular affinity for music, as being reached by music in ways that it couldn't be reached by words or images or any other form of communication. The harper who played for the dying was not simply providing comfort. They were providing a bridge for the soul's departure, a sound path between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. The fairy music that drew mortals into the ring was exploiting the same deep soul music connection, addressing itself not to the rational mind or the social self, but to the soul directly, and the soul, responding to its natural affinity for music, could not simply refuse. The specific rhythms associated with fairy music in the tradition are worth noting. The jig and the reel, the fast, complex, highly rhythmic dance forms that characterise Irish and Scottish traditional music, are the forms most consistently associated with fairy dancing in the accounts. These forms have specific physical effects on the dancer. The rapid footwork, the complex patterns, the unrelenting pace require a level of physical engagement that quickly moves beyond conscious control and into something more automatic, more responsive, more taken over by the rhythm than directed by the will. The fairy ring's music was the jig and the reel at an intensity and a pace that no human musician could sustain, the same forms that produce the most physical and most absorbing dancing in the human world, amplified to a degree that made the human capacity for autonomous decision simply insufficient. The irresistibility of the music was not a flaw in the human listener's character. The tradition did not blame the mortal who entered the ring for weakness of will or failure of discipline. The music was simply beyond human resistance. It was music made by beings whose relationship to sound and rhythm and the human body was deeper and more direct than any human musician could match. To enter the ring and hear the music was to encounter something that your capacity for resistance was not designed to handle. The tradition did not say, be stronger. It said, do not enter the ring, because once you could hear the music, being stronger was no longer the point. Of all the consequences the tradition attributed to entering a fairy ring, the one that appears most consistently and is described most precisely is the distortion of time. Not a vague or uncertain distortion, not simply the sense that time passed quickly, the way any engaging experience passes quickly. The tradition was specific. A night in the ring was a year in the world, or 7 years, or 17, or 100. The mortal who stepped into the circle at dusk and danced through what felt like a single evening stepped out to find that the world outside had aged. The parents who were young when you entered are old when you leave, or dead. The friends have moved on, married, had children who are themselves grown. The farm you knew has changed hands. The village has different faces in it. The world has continued at its own pace while you danced at fairy speed, and the gap between the two rates of progression has opened into something that cannot be bridged by any return. This theme is so consistent across the fairy ring tradition and so closely parallel to the fairy time distortion theme in the broader fairy literature that we explored in an earlier script that it clearly addresses something real and persistent in human experience, but the fairy ring version has specific features that distinguish it from the general fairy time theme and that deserve separate attention. The first specific feature is the role of the dancing. In many fairy time stories, the mortal is simply transported to the fairy realm and kept there. They are guests, or captives, or residents, not necessarily engaged in any particular activity. In the fairy ring tradition, the mortal is always dancing. The dancing is what fills the time, what makes the time pass invisibly, what creates the subjective experience of a single evening, while objective time moves on at years per hour. The dancing is both the activity and the mechanism. The physical absorption in the rhythm is what generates the time distortion, or at least what makes the time distortion experience as a single evening rather than as an incomprehensibly long duration. The physiology of this experience has a real-world parallel in the way that intense physical activity, particularly rhythmic, repetitive physical activity like dancing, affects the perception of time. Studies of time perception have consistently found that people underestimate the duration of experiences characterized by high engagement and physical activity. An hour of dancing is experienced as shorter than an hour of waiting, even though the actual duration is identical. The fairy ring tradition amplifies this well-documented phenomenon to a supernatural extreme. The dancing is so intense, so all-consuming, so perfectly calibrated to maximize engagement, that the time distortion it produces is not a matter of minutes but of years. The second specific feature of the fairy ring time distortion is its irreversibility. In some fairy time stories, the mortal who returns from the fairy realm is able to eventually adapt, to find a place in the changed world, to form new relationships, to continue their life in the altered circumstances. In the fairy ring accounts, this adaptation is rarely possible. The mortal who returns from years of fairy dancing frequently cannot survive the return. The most common account in the tradition is of a mortal who steps out of the ring after what felt like a single night, is told by astonished neighbours that they have been gone for many years, and then ages, or simply disintegrates, turning to dust or collapsing in extreme old age, or simply fading within moments or days of the return. The years that had been held in suspension while the dancer was in the ring catch up with them all at once, and the human body cannot withstand the accumulated weight of the time it had not been living through. This detail, the instantaneous aging or dissolution upon return, appears in enough accounts, across enough separate traditions, to suggest that it was a consistent part of the teaching rather than an embellishment. The tradition was not simply saying that time passed differently in the ring. It was saying that time's passage had a physical consequence for the human body, and that the consequence could not be evaded by returning. The years were real, even if they had been experienced as nothing. The debt to time was real, and the body, emerging from the ring and re-entering ordinary time, was presented with a bill it could not pay. The Scottish tradition preserves several accounts of fairy ring entries that resulted in specific named years of absence, entries that could be placed in historical time because the person who entered was remembered as having disappeared in a specific year, and the person who returned could describe events and people from before that year with perfect clarity, having no memory of anything between. These accounts have the quality of testimony rather than legend, specific, detailed, located in real landscapes with real community memory. They are not proof of fairy intervention, but they are evidence that something was happening to specific people in specific places that the tradition reached for the fairy ring explanation to account for. The Welsh tradition has a particularly detailed account of one Thomas ap Rhys, said to have entered a fairy ring on a hillside in Glamorganshire, and to have been found there by his family, still dancing, still apparently oblivious, but visibly aged, many years after his disappearance. The account of his return describes the aging process in precise terms. Within hours of being pulled from the ring, his hair turned white, his skin became papery and loose, his eyes clouded, and by the following morning he had died. The years he had not lived through caught him on their way back past him. He could not outrun them. The moral weight of the time theft in the fairy ring tradition is different from the moral weight of the time distortion in the voluntary journey to the other world. The hero who chooses to follow the fairy woman to Tir na Nog makes a choice, however poorly understood. The dancer who enters the fairy ring is caught, compelled, victim, rather than adventurer. The tradition treated these differently. The voluntary traveller's time distortion was a consequence of their choice, however unwitting. The fairy ring dancer's time distortion was something done to them. This distinction reinforced the urgency of the prohibition, because the dancer had not chosen the consequence. The prevention of the entry was the community's responsibility as much as the individual's. The warning needed to be clear, and the tradition needed to be maintained precisely because the fairy ring's danger was not something that could be bargained with or negotiated around. It simply needed to be avoided. The few accounts in the tradition of people who entered fairy rings and returned without significant time distortion, the rare cases in which a brief accidental entry was followed by an apparently normal exit, were treated not as evidence that the danger was overstated, but as evidence that the person had been particularly lucky or particularly protected. The absence of the time distortion in these cases was attributed to the brevity of the entry, the person's possession of some form of protective material they were not aware of, or the specific condition of the ring on that occasion. The tradition was not willing to conclude from individual exceptions that the general rule did not hold. What the stolen time theme of the fairy ring tradition was ultimately encoding is something both frightening and philosophically interesting: the recognition that you cannot live in two time streams simultaneously. The fairy world and the human world ran at different speeds, and the mortal who tried to inhabit both, who danced in fairy time while their human life ticked on in human time, did not get to keep both. The ring did not offer a holiday from time. It offered a loan at an interest rate that made repayment impossible. The astronomical dimension of the fairy ring time distortion is an interesting angle that the tradition itself does not always make explicit, but that is consistent with the broader Celtic understanding of time and the cosmos. The Celtic calendar was organised around astronomical events, the solstices and equinoxes, the cross-quarter days that fell between them, and the fairy world's different relationship with time was understood as a different relationship with the same astronomical cycles. The fairy world moved through the year as the human world did, but at a different rate, as though the gears of the two time systems were not quite the same size. The fairy ring, at its most dangerous, was a point where the two gear systems meshed directly, where human time and fairy time were in immediate contact, and where stepping from one to the other exposed the mismatch in their rates of turning. The return accounts, the descriptions of what mortals experienced when they stepped out of the ring after a period of fairy captivity, have a phenomenological consistency that is worth attending to. The returned dancer did not simply find themselves in an unfamiliar world. They found themselves in a world that looked familiar but felt wrong, in a way that was difficult to articulate. The colours were the same, the landscape was the same, but the quality of the light was different, the quality of the silence was different. The sense of where they were in time was completely absent. They knew where they were in space. This was the field, this was the hedge, this was the path home, but the temporal coordinates that normally accompany spatial awareness were simply missing. They did not know what day it was, what year it was, how long they had been gone. The loss of temporal orientation was complete and immediate, preceding the discovery that decades had passed. What the stolen time theme of the fairy ring tradition was ultimately encoding is something both frightening and philosophically interesting: the recognition that you cannot live in two time streams simultaneously. The fairy world and the human world ran at different speeds, and the mortal who tried to inhabit both, who danced in fairy time while their human life ticked on in human time, did not get to keep both. The time they spent in the ring was time spent from their human life, and the accounting was eventually presented. The fairy ring was, among other things, a warning about the cost of being somewhere other than where you belonged, about the price of losing yourself in an experience so complete that the world continues without you. The ring did not offer a holiday from time. It offered a loan, at an interest rate that made repayment impossible. The prohibition on entering fairy rings was not abstract. It was grounded in specific accounts, stories of specific people who had entered specific rings in specific landscapes and had experienced specific consequences. These accounts were the evidence on which the prohibition rested, and they were taken seriously enough to be collected, compared, and transmitted across generations with considerable care. The systematic collection of fairy ring entry accounts began with the 18th century folklorists who first applied something like scholarly methodology to the gathering of folk belief. John Aubrey, whose Miscellanies of 1696 included several accounts of fairy ring encounters in England and Wales. Edmund Jones, the Welsh Presbyterian minister, whose accounts of the supernatural in the parish of Aberystwyth in Monmouthshire, published in 1780, included detailed descriptions of fairy ring incidents, and Walter Scott, whose letters on demonology and witchcraft drew on the rich fairy lore of the Scottish borders, with which he had been familiar from childhood. The accounts collected by these early folklorists share certain consistent features that suggest they are drawing on a common body of experience rather than on a single literary source. The entered ring is always described as preceded by some kind of compulsion, the music heard, or the urge to step inside, or the simple failure to notice the ring's edge until it had been crossed. The duration of the experience inside the ring is always described as subjectively much shorter than its subjective duration. An evening, at most, is what it felt like, regardless of how many years actually passed. The return is always characterized by disorientation and difficulty. The landscape looks wrong, the faces are unfamiliar, the explanations offered by the returned person are initially disbelieved by those who meet them. Edmund Jones's account of the Aberystwyth district includes a case that has been cited by subsequent folklorists as one of the most detailed and most specific in the British record. A young man named Rees, he records, disappeared one night while returning home with a neighbour named Llewellyn. Llewellyn reported hearing music and seeing Rees apparently dancing in the distance. But when he called out, Rees did not respond, and Llewellyn eventually went home alone, assuming Rees had made his own way back. Rees did not return. A search party was organised, and eventually a wise man from the area was consulted, who directed the searchers to place one foot carefully on the edge of a known fairy ring in the locality. From this position, standing at the edge, 1 foot inside, 1 foot outside, they could hear the music and see Rees dancing within the ring, apparently oblivious. They pulled him out. He had no sense that any significant time had passed, and he died within weeks of his return, aged beyond his years by the experience. The 19th century collectors. Thomas Keatley, whose fairy mythology of 1828 gathered accounts from across Europe. William Bottrell, who collected Cornish traditions in the 1870s. And above all, the great Irish collectors, William Butler Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory, added significantly to the record. Gregory's Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland, published in 1920 but drawing on decades of fieldwork in County Galway, is perhaps the richest single source for first-generation accounts of fairy ring encounters in Ireland. The people Gregory interviewed were not recounting ancient legends, but living tradition, things they or their parents or neighbours had experienced or believed they had experienced within living memory. The Cornish tradition collected by Bottrell has a characteristic that distinguishes it somewhat from the Irish and Scottish accounts. The emphasis on the ring as a dancing place that could be encountered accidentally by anyone passing through the landscape at the wrong time, rather than a place that actively drew its victims in. In the Cornish accounts, the mortal who enters the ring is often simply someone who did not know the ring was there, who stumbled into it in the dark or in fog or while distracted, and who was caught not by the music's compulsion, but by the ring's geography, by the sudden impossibility of crossing the line they had just crossed, of exiting through the same boundary through which they had entered. This variant of the tradition reflects a different understanding of the ring's mechanism, not as a lure, but as a trap. The lure version, the music draws you in, the beauty compels you, implies a certain agency on the part of the fairy world, a deliberate effort to attract human attention. The trap version implies something more passive. The ring is a property of the landscape, like a bog or a cliff, and the person who stumbles into it is simply unfortunate rather than specifically targeted. Both versions agree on the consequences. They differ only on the mechanism of capture. The Welsh accounts collected in the 19th century by John Rhys, whose Celtic folklore, Welsh and Manx, was published in 1901, provides some of the most methodologically sophisticated of the early fairy ring testimonies. Rhys was a trained philologist and historian, deeply sceptical of supernatural claims as such, who was nonetheless deeply interested in what the accounts could tell him about the beliefs and practices of the communities that produced them. His analysis of the fairy ring accounts distinguishes between what he calls the core experience, the time distortion, the irresistible music, the impossibility of leaving, and the explanatory framework that the tradition had built around that core experience. The core, he suggested, was in some sense real. Something was happening to the people who described these encounters, and the tradition was the community's best available attempt to account for it. What all the accounts share, across their considerable variation in detail, is a quality of specificity that distinguishes them from clearly literary material. The people who reported fairy ring encounters, or whose family and community members did so, were not telling stories about imaginary characters in imaginary landscapes. They were reporting on events in their own valleys, in their own lifetimes, or the lifetimes of people they had known. The rings they described were real rings in real fields, some of which continued to be visible for generations after the accounts were recorded and could be visited and observed by the folklorist who collected the account. The role of local specialists, the fairy doctors, wise women, and cunning men who served as intermediaries between the human world and the fairy one, in the collection and verification of fairy ring accounts, is worth examining in detail. These specialists were not simply passive recipients of community testimony, they were active investigators, people who would visit a reported fairy ring location to examine the ring itself, to question the person who had reported the encounter, and to assess what protective measures might be needed. Their involvement in the record-keeping of fairy ring encounters gave those encounters a degree of local verification that purely oral tradition did not provide. The fairy doctor's assessment of a fairy ring encounter typically involves several steps. First, the physical examination of the ring, its size, its age, its species composition, if mushrooms were present, its relationship to the surrounding landscape. Second, the questioning of the person who had encountered it. Where were they? What time was it? What did they experience? How long did the experience seem to last? Third, the assessment of consequences. Was the person showing signs of fairy ring effects? Disorientation, loss of time, unusual hunger or thirst, inability to sleep, the sense of music heard at the edge of hearing. And fourth, if necessary, the prescription of countermeasures, protective herbs, protective prayers, specific behavioural changes, and in some cases, formal ritual intervention. The consistency of the fairy doctor's diagnostic framework across different regions and different centuries suggests that the framework was genuinely transmitted rather than independently invented. The same questions, the same assessment criteria, the same countermeasures appear in accounts from County Clare and from the Isle of Man and from the Scottish Highlands, suggesting that a common body of professional knowledge about fairy ring encounters was maintained and transmitted through the network of fairy doctors and wise people across the Celtic world. This professional network was not formally organised in any institutional sense, but it was functionally coherent. The practitioners knew what their colleagues in other areas were advising, and they applied broadly similar methods. The accounts do not prove that fairy rings cause time distortion. They do establish that something was happening in these places and to the people who encountered them, something intense enough to generate consistent, detailed, cross-culturally similar reports across several centuries and several distinct folk traditions. The explanation is still open, but the phenomenon the explanation was trying to account for was genuine. The accounts collected by the 20th century folklorists Catherine Briggs in England, Alexander Carmichael in Scotland, and the various collectors of the Irish Folklore Commission show an interesting shift in character from the earlier 19th century accounts. The 20th century accounts are generally less dramatic in their time distortions, fewer accounts of decades-long absences, more accounts of an evening or a few days unaccountably lost, while maintaining the consistent core features: the music, the compulsive dancing, the difficulty of leaving, the disorientation upon return. This shift may reflect a gradual softening of the tradition as it moved further from the period of its most active maintenance, or it may reflect a genuine difference in the nature of the encounters being reported. What it does not reflect is a simple decline in the reporting of encounters. The 20th century collections are, if anything, richer in individual fairy ring accounts than the 19th century ones, as the collectors had better methods and broader reach. The geographical distribution of fairy ring accounts in the British Isles is not uniform, and the pattern of distribution is itself informative. The densest concentrations of accounts come from the areas of highest Celtic cultural continuity, the Gaelic-speaking areas of Ireland and Scotland, the Welsh-speaking areas of Wales, the Cornish and Manx traditions. In these areas, the fairy ring prohibition was maintained as a living tradition rather than a historical curiosity, and the accounts it generated were accounts of things that happened to people in the present and recent past rather than in the legendary past. The areas of lowest density were, predictably, the most thoroughly anglicised regions, the English Midlands and the home counties, where the folk tradition had been most thoroughly displaced by the dominant culture's different relationship to landscape and supernatural experience. The tradition of recording fairy ring encounter accounts in parish records and estate documents, a practice that appears to have been more common in the 17th and early 18th centuries than is generally acknowledged, provides a category of evidence that sits between the purely oral tradition and the later folklorist collections. Several parish records from rural Ireland and Scotland contain entries that describe, in the clipped and practical language of administrative record-keeping, events that are clearly fairy ring encounters: the disappearance of a named person, the subsequent appearance of that person, in an apparently confused state, after a period of hours or days, the consultation of a local wise person, and the prescribed countermeasures. These records are not folklore. They are the contemporary documentation of events that the communities that experienced them treated as genuine emergencies. The tradition that preserved the prohibition on entering fairy rings also preserved with equal care the methods by which a person who had entered could be retrieved. The existence of these rescue methods is significant in itself. It tells us that the tradition did not regard the fairy ring entry as an absolute and irreversible catastrophe. There was, in the understanding of the people who maintained the prohibition, a window of rescue, a period during which the captured dancer could be retrieved by someone who knew the correct procedure and acted quickly enough. The window was not unlimited, and the correct procedure was not simple, but the tradition was explicit that rescue was possible, and that specific methods had been tested and found to work. The most widely documented rescue method across British and Irish tradition involved the same technique that appears in the account of Rhys in the Edmund Jones collection. The approach to the ring's edge and the establishment of 1 foot inside the ring, while 1 foot remained outside. This straddling position, 1 foot in each world, was understood as the key to perception and action. The person who stood entirely outside the ring could not see or hear what was happening inside it. The person who stepped fully inside was captured themselves, but the person who maintained contact with both worlds simultaneously, 1 foot in fairy space, 1 foot in human space, could perceive the dancer within the ring and could extend a hand or a branch into the ring to make contact. The contact was the mechanism of rescue. Once the rescuer's hand, or the rescuer's grip, on a branch or a rope that the dancer could seize had been established, the pull back through the ring's boundary could begin. The pulling was understood as reorienting the dancer's sense of where they belonged, pulling the name, pulling the nature, pulling the essential human character of the person toward the human world through the medium of physical contact with a person who was still fully of the human world. The rescue was not simply a matter of physical strength. It was a matter of the stronger human pull, the pull of the world the captured person had come from, overcoming the fairy pull that was keeping them in the ring. Iron, as in so many fairy protective contexts, played a role in several versions of the rescue method. An iron object, a knife, a horseshoe, a nail, thrown into the ring in advance of the rescue attempt was believed to disrupt the fairy enchantment enough to give the dancer a moment of clarity, a brief interruption in the music's compulsion during which they might become aware of their situation and of the rescuer at the ring's edge. The iron's disruption of the enchantment was understood as temporary. The fairy music would recover and resume, but temporary might be enough if the rescuer was ready to pull at exactly the moment the clarity appeared. The use of specific herbs in the rescue operation is documented in several Welsh and Irish accounts. St. John's wort, the herb most widely associated with protection against fairy interference, was sometimes carried into the approach to the ring's edge, its presence creating a degree of spiritual protection for the rescuer that made the straddling position safer. Rowan, the great protective tree, was used in similar ways. A rowan branch extended into the ring could serve as the object the dancer sees to be pulled out, the rowan's protective properties helping to anchor the connection between the dancer and the human world throughout the extraction. The verbal component of the rescue, speaking the dancer's name clearly and firmly at the moment of contact, appears in enough accounts to be considered part of the standard method rather than an incidental detail. The name, as we explored in an earlier script, was the connection between the person and their essential nature, and speaking the name at the moment of rescue was understood as using that connection deliberately, as calling the person's nature back to the human world, reinforcing the physical pull with a deeper, name-directed pull on the nature itself. The combination of physical contact, iron disruption, protective herb, and spoken name was understood as a multi-layered rescue operation that addressed the fairy captivity on every level at which it operated. The timing of the rescue was understood as critical in most accounts. The window for successful rescue was believed to be limited. Most commonly, the first year of the captivity was the period during which rescue remained possible, after which the dancer had been so fully integrated into fairy time that the connection to human time was too attenuated to pull on effectively. Several accounts describe rescue attempts that failed because they were made too late. The dancer was found, was perceived, but could not be pulled out because the years of fairy time had so thoroughly reorganized their nature that the human world no longer had a strong enough claim on them. The accounts of failed rescues are in some ways more instructive than the accounts of successful ones. They illuminate what the tradition understood as the mechanism of the captivity, not a physical constraint, but a gradual reorganization of the captive's nature, a slow shift in what they were oriented toward and what felt like home. The dancer who had been in the ring for a year was already somewhat fairy in their orientation. The dancer who had been there for a decade was more fairy than human. The dancer who had been there for 100 years was, in every meaningful sense, no longer a person who could return to the human world and survive the return. The rescue operation was a race against this reorganization, and the tradition preserved both the methods and the honest acknowledgement that the methods were not always successful. The community dimension of the rescue operation is worth noting. In most accounts, the rescue was not performed by a single person working alone, but by a group, organized and directed by someone with knowledge of the correct procedure, typically the fairy doctor or the wise woman of the community, the specialist in fairy interaction whose expertise was exactly what the situation required. The community mobilized in response to a fairy ring captivity the way it might mobilize in response to any other crisis requiring specialized knowledge, gathering the resources, following the direction of the expert, contributing the collective strength of human presence and human concern to the effort of pulling one of their own back from the other world. The accounts of partial rescues, cases in which the captive dancer was pulled partly out of the ring but could not be fully extracted, are among the most harrowing in the tradition. In these accounts, the rescuer managed to establish contact, managed to get a grip on the dancer's hand or clothing, but found that the full extraction was impossible. The dancer resisted or was pulled back by an invisible force, or simply could not pass through the ring's boundary in the way that had been expected. In some of these cases, the partial extraction left the captive in a worse state than either full captivity or full rescue would have, partly in fairy time and partly in human time, experiencing both simultaneously in a way that was described as deeply disorienting and physically painful. The reason given in the tradition for these partial rescue failures was typically the same reason given for the time-limited window of rescue. The dancer had already been too thoroughly integrated into fairy time for the human world's claim on them to be strong enough to override the fairy worlds. But a partial integration was different from a complete one, and the partially integrated dancer occupied a state between the two worlds that the tradition described with particular care and particular concern. This between state was understood as the most dangerous of all. Fully in the fairy world was dangerous but stable, fully in the human world was safe. Between the two was a condition that neither world could properly contain. The physical handling of a person who had been pulled from a fairy ring was the subject of specific guidance in several traditions. The person should not be allowed to sleep immediately upon extraction. Sleep was understood as a state of lowered defenses, and the recently rescued person whose defenses were already compromised was particularly vulnerable to recapture or to the delayed effects of the fairy enchantment during sleep. They should be kept warm, fed with ordinary human food, surrounded by the voices and the presence of family members, all of these actions understood as ways of reinforcing the connection to the human world that the rescue had re-established. and they should be watched carefully for the signs of continuing fairy influence, the hearing of music that others could not hear, the expressed desire to return to the ring, the drifting of attention away from the present and towards some other place. The rescue operation was, in the end, an assertion of the community's claim on its own members, a statement that the human world would not simply accept the loss of one of its people to the fairy world without a fight, that the claim of community and family and the ordinary life had weight enough to be pulled on, that love and belonging were real forces in the world capable of acting against fairy enchantment. Whether or not the procedure succeeded, the attempt was meaningful. It said, "You belong here. We are not letting you go without trying to bring you back." The preparation for a rescue operation in the tradition involved not just the gathering of appropriate tools and substances, but a period of personal preparation for the rescuer. A period of fasting or prayer or specific ritual acts that were understood as increasing the rescuer's own spiritual resilience and the strength of their connection to the human world. A rescuer who was themselves spiritually weakened by illness, by recent grief, by their own proximity to fairy influence, was a rescuer who might be captured in the process of attempting the rescue, adding a second victim to the first. The tradition was clear that the rescue should only be attempted by someone who was themselves fully grounded in the human world, fully oriented toward human time, fully anchored in the human community's claim on the people they were trying to retrieve. The aftermath of a successful rescue was understood as a period of vulnerability that required specific management. The rescue dancer, even if they had been fully extracted from the ring, even if the immediate enchantment had been broken, retained for some time a residual susceptibility to the ring's influence. They were advised to avoid the location of the ring for a significant period, typically at least a year and a day in the tradition's characteristic formulation. They were advised to maintain specific protective practices, carrying iron, wearing rowan, keeping certain herbs in their clothing or their sleeping space, and they were advised to speak carefully about what they had experienced, not to dwell on the memory of the fairy world, not to express longing for the music or the dancing, because the expression of longing was understood as a way of maintaining the connection to the ring that the rescue had tried to sever. The rescue operation was, in the end, an assertion of the community's claim on its own members, a statement that the human world would not simply accept the loss of one of its people to the fairy world without a fight, that the claim of community and family and the ordinary life had the weight enough to be pulled on, that love and belonging were real forces in the world capable of acting against fairy enchantment. Whether or not the procedure succeeded, the attempt was meaningful. It said, "You belong here. We are not letting you go without trying to bring you back." The fairy ring moved from the landscape into the literary imagination at an early stage in the history of English literature, and it has never entirely left. The literary fairy ring is not quite the same thing as the folk fairy ring. The literary tradition selected certain elements of the folk belief, the association with fairy dancing, the circular form, the liminal character of the space, and foregrounded them, while sometimes leaving behind the more specifically dangerous aspects: the time distortion, the impossibility of leaving, the irreversible consequences of entry. The literary fairy ring was often a place of wonder and enchantment rather than a place of danger, a setting for fairy spectacle rather than a trap. But the best literary treatments preserve the ambivalence, the sense that the ring was simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, that the enchantment it offered was inseparable from the peril it represented. Shakespeare's engagement with the fairy ring is most direct in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the rings in the meadow are the traces left by Titania and her train, and where Puck's speech about the fairy round, describing the rings on the grass, the oxlips, and the nodding violets, the woodbine and the musk rose, and the eglantine, is one of the most beautiful pieces of fairy description in English literature. Shakespeare's Fairy Ring is a place of beauty and magic, the scene of fairy revels, and the mortals who stumble into or near fairy territory in the play are certainly transformed by the experience, but Shakespeare softens the danger considerably. His transformed mortals eventually return to something like their normal selves. The time distortion is comic rather than tragic, and nobody crumbles to dust. Edmund Spenser's treatment in The Fairy Queen is closer to the folk tradition in its sense of the fairy ring as a genuinely ambiguous and potentially dangerous space. The enchanted circles in Spenser's allegory carry the weight of the folk belief, the sense that circular forms in the landscape are places where different rules apply, where the ordinary protections of the human world are weakened, where something has been claimed or consecrated by a power other than the human, without always specifying the specific dangers the folk tradition enumerated. The 19th century Romantic poets engaged with the fairy ring as part of their broader interest in folk belief and supernatural landscape. John Keats, whose engagement with fairy lore was deep and personal, used the fairy ring and its associations in several poems, most directly in La Belle Dame sans Merci, where the circle of compulsion and the impossibility of leaving echo the fairy ring tradition even when no ring is explicitly mentioned. The knight who follows the beautiful woman, who finds himself enchanted, who cannot break free of the enchantment even after it has been revealed as dangerous. This is the fairy ring experience translated into a different narrative form. Robert Browning's poem The Pied Piper of Hamelin engages with the fairy ring tradition through the figure of the irresistible music, and The Led-Away Children, another version of the same compulsive following of magical sound that the fairy ring tradition described as the mechanism of entry. The children who follow the piper into the hillside are doing exactly what the mortal who follows the fairy music into the ring does, responding to a sound so compelling that the will cannot resist it, crossing a boundary that cannot subsequently be recrossed, entering a space that is not the ordinary world and from which return is not guaranteed. W. B. Yeats, whose engagement with Irish fairy tradition was both scholarly and personal, returned to the fairy ring in several poems that treated it with something close to its full folk weight. In The Stolen Child, the beckoning fairies draw the child away from a world of weeping, and the reader understands that the drawing away is into the fairy world's time, away from human time, away from the world the child knew. The poem does not use the word ring, but it uses the concept, the circle of enchantment, the enclosed space where different rules apply, the irresistible summons that the child cannot and does not choose to resist. The 20th century's fantasy literature has engaged with the fairy ring in ways that range from the respectful to the inventive. Alan Garner, whose fantasy novels draw deeply on the specific fairy traditions of Cheshire and the north of England, uses the fairy ring with something close to its full folk danger, as a space of genuine peril, not simply of adventure. His rings are thresholds, as the folk tradition always understood them, places where the human world and the fairy world overlap, where the rules of each apply simultaneously and therefore unpredictably, where the person who enters is not the same person who will emerge. Terry Pratchett's engagement with the fairy ring tradition in his Discworld novels is characterized by a respect for the underlying folk belief that his comic register might initially obscure. His fairies, particularly the elves of lords and ladies, are genuinely dangerous beings whose relationship to time and to human beings reflects the full danger of the folk tradition rather than the sanitized literary version. The fairy ring in that novel is precisely what the folk tradition always said it was, a space where the two worlds meet, where the fairy world presses against the human one, where the person who stands in the circle is in genuine and serious danger. Christina Rossetti's poem Goblin Market, which we examined at length in an earlier script on fairy food, engages with the fairy ring tradition obliquely through its central image of the circular enclosed space of temptation, the space where the goblin merchants sell their extraordinary fruit, a space that is not explicitly circular, but that functions in the same way as the fairy ring. Once entered, it compels. Once the food is tasted, ordinary food can never satisfy again. The escape from it requires a specific counter-ritual performed by someone who loves the captured person. Rossetti's poem is not a fairy ring poem, but it draws on the same underlying structure of belief. The influence of the fairy ring on the imagery of the English Romantic and Victorian garden is worth noting. The garden as a space of enclosed beauty, bounded by walls or hedges, separated from the ordinary landscape, subject to different rules, shares its structural logic with the fairy ring, the walled garden of Victorian country houses, the hortus conclusus of medieval illuminated manuscripts, the secret garden of children's fiction. All of these enclosed and magical garden spaces are, at some level, the fairy ring made domestic and safe, the enchanted circle transformed into a human project that aspires to the same quality of specialness while being, we hope, controllable. The fairy ring was the wild version of this aspiration, the version that reminded the aspiring garden maker that some enchanted circles were not controllable and some enclosed beauties were not safe. Neil Gaiman's fantasy fiction engages with the fairy ring tradition through multiple works, but most directly in his novel American Gods and in various shorter works where fairy beings appear at their characteristic threshold locations. Gaiman's fairies are recognisably continuous with the folk tradition. They are not benevolent helpers with sparkly wings, but genuinely other beings operating by their own rules in ways that humans find difficult to predict or manage. His fairy ring equivalents, the crossroads, the thresholds, the specific places where the supernatural world presses against the ordinary one, carry the same character as the folk ring. Markers of a boundary, indicators of a different set of rules, places where the wise person pauses and considers before stepping through. What the literary tradition has preserved most consistently from the folk fairy ring tradition is the circle itself, the specific, bounded, enclosed space where different rules apply. The circle appears in fantasy literature over and over again, in forms that range from the literal mushroom ring to the magical circle of protection, to the sacred space of ritual, to the ring of standing stones. In every form, the circle marks a threshold, a place where inside and outside are meaningfully different, where the crossing of the line has consequences. The folk tradition that generated this literary motif was saying something about the nature of boundaries and about the specific quality of circular forms, about why the circle of all shapes is the one that most powerfully marks a space as set apart. The folk revival movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the movement that sought to recover and celebrate the traditional music, dance and literature of Celtic cultures, engaged with the fairy ring tradition in ways that were simultaneously scholarly and creative. The collectors of folk song and dance who worked in Ireland, Scotland and Wales were collecting the living expressions of the same tradition that generated the fairy ring belief, and they understood the fairy music tradition as the supernatural backdrop against which the folk music tradition made its fullest sense. The best of the traditional tunes were understood to have fairy origins, to have been heard by a musician at the edge of a fairy ring, and retained despite the risk that the hearing itself represented. The specific musical forms that the tradition associated with fairy ring compulsion, the jig, the reel, the hornpipe, have in contemporary performance contexts taken on some of the hypnotic and absorbing quality that the tradition described in supernatural terms. The session, the informal gathering of traditional musicians in a pub or a kitchen, playing sets of jigs and reels at increasingly rapid tempos for hours at a time, is an experience that those who participate in it describe in terms that are recognizably continuous with the fairy ring accounts, the loss of time, the impossibility of simply deciding to stop, the way the music takes over and directs the playing. The tradition was describing something real about these musical forms. The supernatural framework was the tradition's way of accounting for a genuine and powerful quality of the music itself. The fairy ring's influence on the tradition of the fairy tale proper, the literary form developed by Perrault and the Grimms and refined by Anderson, is more pervasive than is often noted because the fairy ring's essential structure recurs in many fairy tale plots, even when no ring is explicitly mentioned. The enchanted space from which the protagonist cannot leave, the magical music that compels movement, the time distortion that separates the enchanted person from their ordinary life, the rescue by someone who loves them. These are the structural elements of the fairy ring tradition, and they appear in story after story in the fairy tale canon, adapted and varied but recognizable in their underlying shape. What the literary tradition has preserved most consistently from the folk fairy ring tradition is the circle itself, the specific bounded enclosed space where different rules apply. The circle appears in fantasy literature over and over again, in forms that range from the literal mushroom ring to the magical circle of protection, to the sacred space of ritual, to the ring of standing stones. In every form, the circle marks a threshold, a place where inside and outside are meaningfully different, where the crossing of the line has consequences. The folk tradition that generated this literary motif was saying something about the nature of boundaries and about the specific quality of circular forms, about why the circle of all shapes is the one that most powerfully marks a space as set apart. The fairy ring was not only a danger and a curiosity, it was, in the Celtic understanding, a sacred space, a place where the divine and the mortal overlapped, where the ordinary rules of the human world were suspended in favour of something older and more fundamental, where the circle itself was a statement about the nature of the enclosed space and the quality of what it contained. The circle is one of humanity's oldest and most widely used sacred forms, from the stone circles of Neolithic Britain to the circular temples of the ancient world, to the medicine wheels of the North American plains, to the mandala of Buddhist and Hindu tradition. Across an extraordinary range of cultures and periods, the circle recurs as the shape that marks sacred space. Its significance varies across traditions, but certain themes recur. The circle is complete, having neither beginning nor end. It is inclusive, containing what is within it without discrimination. It is exclusive, marking a clear boundary between inside and outside. And it is equidistant from its centre at every point, creating a space of perfect symmetry that has no privileged direction. The Celtic tradition's relationship with the circle as sacred form was expressed most visibly in the stone circles that dotted the landscape of Britain and Ireland. Stonehenge and Avebury in England, Callanish in the Outer Hebrides, the Dromberg Circle in County Cork, and hundreds of smaller rings throughout the British Isles and Brittany. These circles were built before the Celtic period in the strict archaeological sense, but they were integrated into the Celtic landscape and the Celtic sacred geography. They became places of significance in the Celtic tradition even though they predated it. their age and their form giving them an authority that the tradition respected. The Nemeton, the sacred grove of the Druids, was often circular in its natural form, and when it was not, the Druids sometimes formalized it into a circle through the arrangement of posts or the clearing of a circular space within the woodland. The circle marked the sacred precinct, the space within which different rules applied, the area of heightened spiritual presence and diminished ordinary physicality. To enter the Nemeton was to enter a different quality of space, and the circle was the marker of that difference. The fairy ring, in this context, was not an anomaly, but an expression of a much older tradition of circular sacred space, or rather, it was the natural world's own version of the same tradition. The Nemeton was a human-constructed circle, a deliberate marking of sacred space by people who understood the symbolic significance of the circular form. The fairy ring was a naturally occurring circle that happened in the folk tradition's understanding to serve the same function for the fairy world, marking a space set apart, a space where the fairy world's rules applied, a space whose circular form was both the sign and the consequence of the sacred activity it contained. The Gaelic word for a fairy ring, Faerie, the ring of the fairies, or sometimes Leos, the fort or enclosure, reflects this understanding of the ring as an enclosed space, a defined and bounded territory, rather than simply a circular mark on the ground. The Leos in particular connects the fairy ring to the ring fort, the circular earthwork that was the primary form of Celtic settlement in Ireland, a physical enclosure that provided both practical protection and symbolic definition of the space within. The fairy ring was the fairy world's own Leos, its enclosure, its defined space, the visible marker of its claimed and consecrated territory. The direction of entry into a sacred circle was significant in the Celtic tradition. To enter a sacred space by moving in the sunwise direction, deosil, clockwise, following the path of the sun, was to enter in harmony with the natural order, to align yourself with the movement of the cosmos. To enter in the counter-sunwise direction, tuathal, widdershins, against the sun, was to enter against the natural order, in an orientation that was associated with the reversal of the ordinary, with the negative or the dangerous, with the kind of power that the ordinary world did not sanction. The accounts of fairy ring rescue sometimes specify that the approach to the ring's edge should be made in a specific direction, that the rescuer should circle the ring in the sunwise direction before establishing the 1 foot in position, or that the captured dancer should be pulled out in a specific direction, rather than simply in whatever direction was most convenient. This specificity reflects the understanding of the ring as a sacred space with its own internal orientation, a space in which the direction of the movement carried meaning, and where the correct direction of movement was essential to achieving the desired effect. The medieval Christian tradition attempted to reframe the fairy ring's sacred character in specifically Christian terms, describing the ring as a site of demonic rather than fairy activity, the circle where the devil's servants danced, the mark of unholy assembly. This reframing preserved the essential character of the ring as a sacred space while inverting its moral valence. The tradition maintained that the ring was significant, that it marked a space where something powerful had been present, that the person who entered it without proper understanding and preparation was taking a serious risk. It changed the explanation for the significance without changing the significance itself. The relationship between the fairy ring and the practice of circle casting in various magical traditions is a direct expression of the same underlying logic. In Wiccan and other neo-pagan traditions, the magic circle, cast at the beginning of a ritual and formally closed at its conclusion, creates a sacred enclosed space that operates by different rules from the ordinary world outside it. Within the circle, the divine is present. Outside it, the ordinary world continues. The circle is the boundary between two kinds of reality, and the crossing of the circle, both entering it and leaving it, is understood as a significant act that requires specific attention and specific protocol. This is exactly the fairy ring's logic, translated into a deliberately constructed and controlled ritual form. The stone circle, as a large-scale human construction of the fairy ring principle, deserves more attention than it typically receives in this context. The builders of Stonehenge and Avebury, and the thousands of smaller stone circles that dot the British and Irish landscape, were encoding in permanent stone the same understanding of circular form that the fairy ring expressed in grass and mushroom: a boundary, an enclosure, a space set apart where different rules applied. The circles of stone were the human attempt to create a stable, permanent version of what the fairy ring offered temporarily and unpredictably, a space where the divine was accessible, where the ordinary world was held at bay, where the specific quality of the enclosed space allowed for contact with something larger than the human. The practice of building circular earthworks, the ring fort of Ireland, the hill forts of Britain, the circular enclosures of the Neolithic, reflects the same understanding in its defensive and political expressions. The circle as enclosure protected what was within it, not only physically but symbolically. The circular boundary said, "This is our space. Within this line we are gathered. Outside this line is the other." The fairy ring's claim on the space within its boundary was the fairy world's version of the same assertion: a territorial marker, a boundary declaration, a statement of occupation and sovereignty over a specific portion of the landscape. The persistence of the fairy ring as a significant landscape feature across the transformation from pre-Christian to Christian practice reflects the depth of the belief. Sacred spaces are difficult to desacralize simply by changing the theological framework that explains their significance. The ring was there in the landscape year after year, its circle complete and its boundary clear. Whatever explanation was current for why it was there and what it meant, the ring itself continued to command respect. The circle enclosed something. The circle marked a threshold. The circle said, "Here a different set of rules applies." And the tradition, whatever its theological clothing at any given moment, preserved that message with remarkable consistency. The fairy ring's relationship to the broader Celtic tradition of boundary observance, the careful attention to all kinds of boundaries, physical and temporal and social, illuminates its significance within that tradition's wider framework. The Celtic world was, in the understanding of those who inhabited it, a world organised around boundaries: the boundaries between the human world and the fairy world, between the living and the dead, between the warm season and the cold season, between the cultivated land and the wild. These boundaries were not simply lines on a map or points on a calendar. They were thresholds, places and times where one kind of reality gave way to another, where the rules changed, where the person who crossed needed to be aware of which side they were now on. The specific vulnerability of boundaries to interference, the way that thresholds attracted supernatural attention and supernatural activity, was understood as a feature of boundaries themselves rather than a property of any specific type of boundary. The doorway of a house, the edge of a ploughed field, the shore between land and sea, the moment of dusk between day and night, all of these boundaries were understood as places where the ordinary protective distinctions between the human world and the other world were at their weakest, where the fairy world was most able to press through, and where the human world's inhabitants needed to be most alert. The fairy ring was a permanent version of this temporary boundary condition. a physical feature of the landscape that created a persistent threshold, a point where the two worlds were always in contact, rather than only at the specific liminal moments of the calendar. The Irish concept of the rath, the earthwork enclosure, circular in form, that was the characteristic settlement form of early medieval Ireland, connects the fairy ring tradition to the archaeology of habitation in a way that enriches both. Many of the raths that dot the Irish landscape became in folk tradition the fairy forts, places where the Tuatha De Danann lived underground, places where the fairy ring was not simply a mark on the grass, but the surface expression of an entire underground world. The fairy ring on the grass above the rath was understood as the dancing place of the rath's inhabitants, the place where the world inside met the world outside, the circle that marked the boundary between the underground fairy world and the surface human one. The persistence of the fairy ring as a significant landscape feature across the transformation from pre-Christian to Christian practice reflects the depth of the belief. Sacred spaces are difficult to desacralize simply by changing the theological framework that explains their significance. The ring was there in the landscape year after year, its circle complete and its boundary clear. Whatever explanation was current for why it was there and what it meant, the ring itself continued to command respect. The circle enclosed something. The circle marked a threshold. The circle said, here a different set of rules applies. And the tradition, whatever its theological clothing, at any given moment, preserved that message with remarkable consistency. The fairy ring prohibition has not simply survived into the contemporary world as a historical curiosity. It is, in various forms and with varying degrees of explicitness, still observed. In parts of rural Ireland, Scotland and Wales, in communities that maintain living connections to the folk tradition rather than merely academic interest in it, the fairy ring is still treated with a degree of caution that goes beyond simple habit. Farmers in these areas may continue to avoid ploughing over known fairy rings in their fields, not because they necessarily believe in an absolute sense that the fairies will punish them for doing so, but because the long tradition of treating these circles as significant spaces has created a kind of cultural inertia that makes disturbing them feel wrong. The feeling is not irrational. It is a form of respect for the landscape's history, for the accumulated observations of generations who found these circles worth attending to. The more explicit forms of the belief persist in communities that maintain strong connections to the Gaelic and Welsh traditions. The festivals of folklore, the living oral tradition, the continued transmission of folk knowledge from older to younger members of specific communities, these keep the fairy ring prohibition in active circulation, not as a museum piece, but as part of the living fabric of how people understand their landscape and their relationship to it. The grandmother who warns the grandchild not to play inside the mushroom ring in the field is not necessarily offering a supernatural explanation. She may be offering something more nuanced, a caution about the history of that place, a transmission of the community's long accumulated respect for that circle, a preservation of the connection between the landscape and the people who have lived in it for generations. The contemporary pagan revival, the Wiccan, Druidic, and other neo-pagan traditions that began to develop in the mid-20th century and that have grown significantly in the decades since, has engaged with the fairy ring with considerable seriousness. For practitioners in these traditions, the fairy ring is understood as a naturally occurring sacred space, a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world is thin, a location particularly suited to ritual work of certain kinds. This understanding draws directly on the folk tradition's account of the ring as a fairy threshold, translating it into a contemporary practice that honours the essential structure of the older belief. The neo-pagan engagement with fairy rings includes specific ritual protocols for approaching them, for working within or at the edge of them, and for closing the working when it is complete. These protocols bear a recognizable family resemblance to the folk tradition's rescue methods. The same attention to the boundary between inside and outside, the same use of protective substances and specific directional approaches, the same care about who enters and under what conditions. The tradition has been translated into a new idiom, but the essential structure of the engagement with the ring has been maintained. In the broader culture, beyond the specifically folk-observant and specifically pagan communities, the fairy ring prohibition persists in a more diffuse form, as a kind of cultural intuition. The sense that these circles in the grass are worth noticing, that there is something about them that commands a moment's pause, that the person who simply walks through without looking is missing something. This intuition does not require a full belief in fairies. It requires only the recognition that certain features of the landscape have accumulated significance over time, that places which have been attended to with care and respect across many generations carry something of that accumulated attention with them. The academic study of fairy rings, in both their folkloric and their biological dimensions, has experienced a significant revival in recent decades. Ethnobotanists and folklorists have collaborated on studies of the distribution of fairy ring reports in relation to the distribution of specific fungal species, finding significant correlations that illuminate the biological foundation of the tradition. Historians of religion have examined the fairy ring in the context of the broader Celtic sacred circle tradition, exploring the connections between the folk belief and the older pre-Christian religious practices of which it may be a continuation. Ecologists have used the presence of long-established fairy rings as indicators of old grassland habitats, understanding the ring's persistence as evidence of the stability and antiquity of the ecological community in which they occur. The fairy ring's role in contemporary ecology is worth dwelling on because it illustrates a dimension of the prohibition that the folk tradition may have been encoding without articulating explicitly, that fairy rings are signs of ecological health and continuity, and that disturbing them is therefore an act of ecological as well as spiritual consequence. The grasslands that support long-established fairy rings are, by definition, grasslands that have not been ploughed or heavily fertilized or subjected to the agricultural interventions that destroy fungal communities. They are among the most biodiverse and ecologically rich habitats in the British landscape. The prohibition on disturbing fairy rings preserved these habitats from interference at a time when ecological reasoning was not available to explain why they deserved preservation. The spiritual framework served a conservation function that the biological framework had not yet been developed to serve. The fairy ring's role in the seasonal calendar of folk practice is worth noting. Certain times of year were understood as particularly active times for fairy rings. The great liminal festivals of the Celtic calendar, Samhain and Beltane above all, when the boundary between the human world and the fairy world was at its most permeable. The fairy rings that were quiescent for most of the year were understood to become active at these times, the music more audible, the pull of the ring more insistent, the danger of accidental entry more acute. The protective practices associated with Samhain and Beltane, the lighting of protective fires, the carrying of iron, the staying close to home, were therefore also protective practices against the fairy ring's increased activity at these boundary times. The persistence of caution around fairy rings in farming communities is supported by a body of practical observation that does not require supernatural belief to be reasonable. Fairy rings in pasture do affect livestock. The zones of withered grass within the ring are areas where grazing is reduced. The zones of enhanced grass growth are areas where selective grazing creates uneven pasture management challenges, and the toxicity of some fairy ring species to livestock means that the identification and monitoring of rings has genuine practical agricultural significance. The farmer who avoided disturbing an established fairy ring was, at the practical level, avoiding the disruption of a stable fungal community whose effects on the pasture had been mapped over generations of observation and whose predictable behaviour was preferable to the unpredictable behaviour that might follow disturbance. The fairy ring's appearance in contemporary gardening literature and practice as a problem to be managed, a symptom to be treated, a challenge for the lawn enthusiast, represents one of the most complete divorces of the phenomenon from its cultural context. The advice columns that explain how to break up fairy ring mycelium with aeration forks and nitrogen treatments are engaging with exactly the same phenomenon that the folk tradition described with awe and caution, using the complete explanatory reversal of modern agronomy in place of the folk explanation. Neither framework fully accounts for the other's response to the phenomenon. The agronomist's ring is a fungal management problem. The folk tradition's ring is a fairy threshold. The ring itself is the same ring. The ring is still there, in the fields and the meadows, and the old grasslands of Britain and Ireland. It is still drawing its circle, still expanding slowly outward each year, still producing its mushrooms in the autumn after rain. It is still significant, whether you understand its significance in fairy terms or ecological terms, or simply as the significance of something that has been there for a very long time, and that the landscape has organised itself around. The ring commands a pause. Step around it, notice it, honour it in whatever way your understanding allows, and take seriously, in whatever register makes sense to you, the very old and very consistent warning: do not step inside. The fairy ring's connection to land rights and community governance in the pre-enclosure landscape of Britain and Ireland adds a dimension to the prohibition that is rarely discussed in purely folkloric terms. In the open field system that characterised much of the medieval and early modern British countryside, the common land, the shared grazing, the unenclosed meadow, the field edges and verges, was managed collectively by the community through a set of customary rules that combined practical agricultural necessity with the inherited understanding of the landscape's significant features. The fairy ring was often located on common land, and the community's prohibition on disturbing it was a piece of common land management, a customary rule about what was and was not permitted in a specific location, enforced by community understanding and community memory, rather than by any legal code. The enclosure of the common lands, the legal process by which customary shared land was transferred into private ownership, a process that intensified dramatically in the 18th and 19th centuries, destroyed many of the landscape conditions in which fairy ring belief had been maintained as a living tradition. When the common was enclosed, its management passed from community custom to private decision, and the customary prohibition on disturbing the ring no longer had the community structure to sustain it. The new landowner, who had no relationship with the land's customary history, might plough over a ring that had been respected for generations. The physical disappearance of rings through agricultural change coincided with and contributed to the gradual erosion of the living tradition that had attached significance to them. We have spent 10 chapters walking around the fairy ring, looking at it from every angle the tradition offers. We have examined its biology, the fungal mycelium expanding through the soil, producing a circle of mushrooms, creating its bands of lush and withered grass through the chemistry of nutrient depletion and nitrogen release, we have followed the folk tradition's explanation of the same phenomena. The dancing fairies, the midnight music, the trace left in the grass by fairy feet. We have listened to the music, understood the mechanism of compulsion, sat with the accounts of those who heard it, and stepped inside. We have traced the time distortion, the stolen hours that were years outside, the returned dancer who crumbled on the threshold of their own life. We have read the folklorist accounts, compared the testimonies, followed the rescue operations through their protocols of iron and rowan and spoken name. We have watched the ring move through the literary tradition, from Shakespeare to Yeats to contemporary fantasy. We have understood it as a sacred circle within the Celtic cosmological framework of enclosed space. We have traced its survival into the present day, in farming practice and neo-pagan ritual and ecological knowledge. Now it is time to ask the final question. What does the ring mean? The ring means, first and most immediately, that this is a boundary. The circle is the clearest possible statement that there is an inside and an outside, that different things are true in each, and that the crossing from one to the other is not a trivial act. The folk tradition was specific about what made the inside different from the outside. Inside fairy time applied. Inside the music was irresistible. Inside human nature was gradually reorganized toward the fairy world and away from the human one. Whether or not you accept the fairy explanation for these differences, the tradition was saying something true. The inside of the ring is different from the outside. The difference is real, the crossing is consequential. The ring means, second, that some spaces have been claimed by something other than the human world. The history of European colonization of the natural landscape is largely a history of the extension of human claims over spaces that previously had other inhabitants, other rulers, other uses. The fairy ring prohibition is a remnant of a different understanding, the understanding that not all space belongs to the human world, that some spaces have been claimed by other presences, and that the appropriate response to encountering those spaces is to acknowledge the claim rather than simply to override it. The ring marked fairy territory. Entering it without acknowledgement was trespass. The tradition was preserving a recognition that the human world was not the only world that had claims on the landscape. The ring means, third, that absorption has a cost. The mortal who entered the ring and danced, who was so completely absorbed by the music, the movement, the overwhelming sensory experience of the fairy world, paid for that absorption with their human time. The years passed outside while they danced inside. The life they had intended to live continued without them. The people they loved aged without them. And when they returned, the debt was presented in full, with interest. The ring was a warning about the seductive danger of total absorption, of entering an experience so completely that the rest of life becomes invisible, the way the walls of the ring became invisible to the dancer, and the world outside became as remote as a dream. In this reading, the fairy ring is a story about the cost of losing yourself in something beautiful. The music was extraordinarily beautiful. The dancing was exhilarating. The fairy company was unlike any human company, and none of it was worth what it cost. Not because beauty is not worth having, but because this particular beauty came with a price tag that was concealed at the moment of entry and only revealed at the moment of return, by which time the payment had already been made and could not be recalled. The ring means, fourth, that circles are powerful precisely because they are complete. The circle has no gap, no door, no weak point. It is the form that most completely encloses what it contains and most completely excludes what it does not contain. The fairy ring was dangerous for the same reason that a circle of protection was powerful. The form itself was the magic. The completeness itself was the operative principle. What the folk tradition understood about circular forms was not arbitrary. The circle does do something to the perception of what is inside it, to the experience of what is enclosed by it, to the relationship between the enclosed space and the space beyond the boundary. The folk tradition encoded this understanding in the specific and vivid form of the fairy ring danger. The ring means, fifth, that the old landscape is not neutral. The fields and meadows of Britain and Ireland are not empty spaces onto which any meaning can be projected. They have been lived in, attended to, given significance by generations of people who paid careful attention to specific features and encoded what they found in the form of tradition, prohibition, and cautionary tale. The fairy ring is one of the most vivid of these encoded observations, one of the clearest signals that this particular place has been attended to, found significant and warned about. To walk past a fairy ring without acknowledgement is to ignore a conversation that has been going on for centuries. The tradition is still speaking. The ring is still there. The question is whether we are still listening. The ring means, finally, that some things are better approached from the outside. The wisdom of the fairy ring tradition is not the wisdom of avoidance for its own sake. It is not saying that the beautiful and the mysterious and the genuinely other should simply be fled from, that wonder is always dangerous, and engagement is always a mistake. It is saying something more specific, that this particular wonder, in this particular form, is best approached from the edge rather than from the centre, that the observer who stands at the boundary and looks in can see what the dancer inside cannot see, that the perspective of the person who has not entered is sometimes more complete than the perspective of the person who has. To stand at the edge of the fairy ring and look in is to understand what the tradition was always trying to transmit, the sense of another world pressing against this one, legible through the boundary if you look carefully, visible in the way the grass grows differently and the air feels different, and the silence has a quality that the silence outside the ring does not have. The ring is beautiful from the outside, it is dangerous from the inside, and the tradition that preserved both of these truths simultaneously was a tradition that understood the world well enough to know that beauty and danger were not opposites, that the most beautiful things were often the most dangerous, and that knowing this did not diminish the beauty. It just told you where to stand. Stand at the edge, look in, notice the circle, the precision of it, the completeness, the way it sits in the landscape, as though it has been placed there by intention, because in every sense that matters, it has. Notice what it marks, and respect what it marks, and carry the tradition's long, careful, transmitted wisdom with you when you walk away. The ring is real, the boundary is real, and the world on the other side of the boundary is not the same as this one. The fairy ring as a symbol of the irreversibility of certain choices is one of its most enduring meanings, and one that resonates far beyond the specific context of fairy belief. The person who stepped into the ring could not simply step back out. The crossing of the boundary had consequences that did not evaporate when the crossing was reversed. This principle, that certain boundaries, once crossed, leave a mark that persists regardless of the subsequent direction of travel, is one of the most fundamental insights about the nature of significant experience. Some things cannot be unexperienced, some crossings cannot be uncrossed, some knowledge once acquired cannot be set aside. The fairy ring was the tradition's most vivid image for this principle. The fairy ring also speaks to the specific character of the present moment, to the quality of attention that the present moment requires and deserves. The dancer in the ring was not present in the ordinary sense. They were absorbed elsewhere, in a time stream that was not their own. The world outside the ring continued in the present moment, while the dancer existed in a kind of eternal present of the dance, a state of perpetual nowness that had no past or future, only the music and the movement. This is, paradoxically, both a vivid description of total absorption in the present moment and a vivid description of absence from it. The dancer was completely in their experience and completely absent from their life. The tradition was drawing a distinction between the experience of the present moment and the life that exists in the present moment, a distinction that is easy to lose sight of in any experience of sufficient intensity. The ring in contemporary imagination often carries a quality of wistfulness alongside its warning, the sense that what the ring contains, however dangerous, is also genuinely beautiful, and that the beauty is not entirely to be dismissed. The folk tradition itself preserved this ambivalence. The music was extraordinary, the dancing was extraordinary, the fairy company was extraordinary, and none of this was simply a lie or a trick. The danger was real and the beauty was real, and the two were inseparable. To enter the ring was to access something genuinely worth accessing at a cost that simply was not worth paying. The tradition did not say that the fairy world had nothing to offer. It said that what it offered came at a price that was too high. Stand at the edge, look in, notice the circle, the precision of it, the completeness, the way it sits in the landscape as though it has been placed there by intention, because in every sense that matters, it has. Notice what it marks, and respect what it marks, and carry the tradition's long, careful, transmitted wisdom with you when you walk away. The ring is real, the boundary is real, and the world on the other side of the boundary is not the same as this one. Sleep well. The circle is complete. The grass grows differently within it, and somewhere in the quiet of the night, in a field not too far from here, the music that you cannot quite hear is playing. Sleep well. The circle is complete. The grass grows differently within it, and somewhere in the quiet of the night, in a field not too far from here, the music that you cannot quite hear is playing.